Hello, good evening. Welcome to another episode of American Reconquista. I'm your host, Emilio Pons. Last night, New Yorkers witnessed more than a mayoral debate. They witnessed a clash of worldviews. On that stage were Andrew Cuomo, Curtis Sliwa, and Zohran Mamdani, flanked by a panel of journalists who expected another night of campaign talking points. What they got instead was a referendum on logic, economics, and the very definition of justice. Because this time, the slogans met the facts. From the first question, name your headline for 2027, the stage became theater. Cuomo promised stability, Sliwa safety, and Mamdani declared, "I will continue to take on Trump and delivering affordability for New Yorkers." To his followers, it may sound heroic until you ask, how? Mamdani's answer to nearly every policy question was a version of, make it free. Free buses, free childcare, freeze the rent. It's a catchy trinity until you check the budget. New York City adopted budget for the fiscal year of 2025 is $84.6 billion. The Department of Education alone consumes $28.9 billion, more than one-third of all city funds. Add to that $12 billion for social services, $2 billion for homelessness, another $2 billion for migrant costs, and so on, and the ledger is already bleeding. There is simply no secret vault labeled free. Yet, on debate night, Mamdani told viewers that bus fares, roughly $700 million a year, could be wiped away with a simple tax increase on the top 1%. He claimed that raising corporate tax rates to match New Jersey's temporary surtax would yield $5 billion. The problem is, the mayor of New York City can't change the state tax code. Only Albany can. Cuomo reminded him of that fact twice. Mamdani dodged the question twice. Instead of numbers, he gave nostalgia. We need dignity. A fine word, dignity, but it doesn't balance a budget. Curtis Sliwa took a different tack. He called out the reality that half of all bus riders already don't pay their fare. In 2024, fare evasion cost the MTA about $1 billion. If buses become free, what replaces that lost revenue? From Mamdani, silence. What replaces the lost sense of civic reciprocity? More silence from Mamdani. This is the new political theater, the production of virtue without the burden of arithmetic. And it continued throughout the night, issue after issue. Housing, policing, climate change, immigration, and so on. Mamdani's platform sounded generous until you traced every promise to its fiscal endpoint. That endpoint was always debt. Cuomo's rebuttals were blunt, sometimes inelegant, but they revealed a pattern from Mamdani, the habit of announcing compassion and outsourcing the cost to a future administration. Sliwa, ever the street-level populist, pressed him on safety, on crime, and on illegal immigration. Each time, Mamdani answered with the moral equivalent of a sigh, "We'll invest in community safety." But what does that even mean? According to his campaign, it means expanding programs like Be Heard, sending mental health responders instead of police to certain 911 calls, which I will discuss in detail later. However, that's not reform. It's simple rebranding. The pattern is now unmistakable. Take a structural problem, debt, crime, housing, rename it in moral language, announce a task force, and declare victory. It's not governance. It's theater for people who confuse empathy with effectiveness. But the night's most dangerous performance wasn't about budgets. It was about words. When the debate turned to the Middle East, Mamdani invoked a lexicon that has become the moral currency of modern activism: genocide, occupation, apartheid, siege. Each term carries specific legal weight, each one rooted in post-war international law, and each misused becomes a weapon of misinformation. The term genocide is grossly inaccurate when applied to Israel's actions in Gaza. Under the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, genocide requires a demonstrable intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. Israel's military operations target Hamas combatants and infrastructure, not civilians or Palestinians as a group, and are conducted within the framework of self-defense under international law. Remember, this is a war. Civilian casualties, while tragic, do not constitute genocide under any legal standards. Thus, labeling Israel's actions as genocide has no foundation in international jurisprudence and serves instead as a libelous anti-Semitic smear weaponized by Islamist propagandists like Mamdani and their sympathizers to delegitimize the Jewish state under the guise of humanitarian concern. Yet, genocide rolls off the tongue because it moralizes the speaker. It turns complexity into purity. I accuse, therefore I am righteous. But righteousness, built on distortion, corrodes public reasoning. The term occupation is inaccurate when applied to Israel's relationship with Gaza and the West Bank. Israel fully withdrew from Gaza in 2005, leaving no military or civilian presence, and the West Bank's status remains disputed rather than occupied, pending a negotiated settlement as outlined in the Oslo Accords. Under international law, occupation requires effective control over a territory belonging to another sovereign state, conditions which do not exist here, as no recognized Palestinian state has ever existed. Therefore, labeling Israel's presence or actions as an occupation has no legal basis and functions instead, once again, as a libelous anti-Semitic slogan deployed by Islamists like Mamdani and anti-Israel activists to delegitimize Jewish self-determination under the false veneer of humanitarian concern. Palestine is a disputed territory pending a political settlement, not a colony. To call it an occupation may score applause lines amongst idiots, but it rewrites law by repetition. And when laws are rewritten by rhetoric, justice too becomes theater. Calling Israel an apartheid state is factually and legally false. Apartheid, as defined under international law, refers to an institutionalized regime of systematic racial oppression and domination, conditions that do not exist in Israel or the territories it administers. Arab citizens of Israel enjoy full civil rights, representation in the Knesset, representation in the IDF, vote, serve in parliament, hold judicial and academic positions. Restrictions in the West Bank stem from ongoing security concerns and the absence of a final peace settlement, not racial or ethnic policy. Therefore, once again, labeling Israel's self-defense and counter-terrorism measures as apartheid is an unfounded anti-Semitic slander promoted by Islamists like Mamdani and anti-Israel agitators to delegitimize the Jewish state under the guise of human rights advocacy. Security restrictions in the West Bank are tied to counterterrorism, not race. The term, applied this way, is not just false, it's defamatory. Finally, let's talk about the siege of Gaza. In international law, a siege is the encirclement of a city for the purpose of starvation or extermination. The claim that Israel imposes a siege on Gaza is also inaccurate and legally baseless. Israel enforces a security blockade, not a siege, in coordination with Egypt, aimed solely at preventing weapons smuggling and terrorist infiltration by Hamas, which is a recognized jihadist organization. Essential humanitarian aid, food, water, fuel, and medical supplies regularly enter Gaza through Israel crossings, contradicting any notion of deliberate starvation or extermination. Under international law, a siege intended to destroy a population would indeed constitute genocide, something entirely absent here. To accuse Israel of genocide, siege, apartheid is not an act of moral conscience. It is an act of moral corruption. Those words are wielded not to defend human rights, but to deny the Jewish people theirs. They recycle the oldest hatred on earth in the language of modern activism. One does not cease to be anti-Semitic merely by swapping slurs for slogans. It is no different from someone claiming to oppose racism while solemnly repeating long discredited lies about black inferiority. The vocabulary has evolved, but the poison is the same. Those who traffic in these accusations cloak malice in virtue, turning the vocabulary of justice into a weapon of hate. And this matters because language shapes policy. If voters are told that their city's next mayor sees genocide where international courts see armed conflict, how will that mayor interpret federal law or negotiate with Washington or allocate security cooperation funds? Precision isn't pedantry. It's the foundation of credible governance. Cuomo challenged him directly. Do you recognize Israel's right to exist? Mamdani's answer? That he supports it without hierarchy or race or religion. Sounds egalitarian, but smuggles in the same premise, that Israel's very identity as a Jewish state is a moral flaw to be corrected. It is a rhetorical trick, affirmation phrased as negation, and it's false. This, New Yorkers, is why debates matter. They expose how words are used not to describe reality, but to conquer it. We live in an age when language is no longer a vessel for truth, but a weapon for ideology. In that sense, the October 16 debate was more than politics. It was a seminar in how words can be emptied of meaning until only emotion remains. And emotion without evidence is the shortest road to bad policy. We have unpacked the language of the debate. Now, let's follow the money, the math, and the logic. Because behind every moral slogan lies a ledger, and ledgers don't care about hashtags. The central promise was affordability. But affordability cannot be decreed into existence. It is created and earned through productivity, efficiency, and confidence in markets. Free buses, free childcare, frozen rents, city-run grocery stores. It all sounds like a rescue plan until you run the numbers. Every fare-free bus means $700 million in lost revenue a year. Universal childcare for New York's 300,000 youngest children would cost, by Mamdani's own admission, roughly between $5 and $6 billion before building a single classroom. Add public housing construction at $568,000 per unit for 400,000 units. That's 114 billion, even stretched within 10 years during which Mamdani won't be mayor. You don't need an MBA to see that the math, like the young say, isn't mathing. The amounts are astronomical. When asked about funding, Mamdani's answer always was, tax the rich. It was as though the city were a video game where new coins appear every time you press a button labeled equity. But real life is governed by behavior, not buttons, and by reality. Each time the city raises its top rates, high-income earners leave. Between 2020 and 2024, New York lost roughly 160,000 taxpayers who earned over $200,000 a year. Those 160,000 people funded nearly half the city's personal income tax revenue. When they leave the social programs, they were meant to support collapse under their own weight. You cannot redistribute wealth that no longer exists within your jurisdiction. History warns us about this. New York in the 1970s nearly went bankrupt under the same philosophy. Spend first, do the accounting later. London in the 1970s did too. Every cycle ends the same way. An exodus of producers, a spiral of debt, and emergency austerity measures imposed by those once denounced as heartless. True compassion requires competence. If policy is a promise to the poor, math is the test of that promise. Fail the math, and you fail the people. Even Cuomo, who by no means is a conservative, understands this. He warned that a rent freeze without fiscal coverage bankrupts landlords and erodes housing stock. Sliva added that free transit becomes a mobile shelter system for the homeless without added service capacity. These are not opinions. They're case studies in cause and effect. But Mamdani's magical claims are not limited to his economic policy. For example, during the debate, Mamdani made the fabulous claim that making buses free magically makes them also safer, and that it decreases assaults on bus drivers by 38.9%. This is a non sequitur par excellence. He went on to claim that New Yorkers deserve more than slow buses with an average speed of 4.9 miles an hour. But what is he going to do? Is he going to magically get rid of traffic, which is what slows down the buses, whether they're free or not? Free or not, buses are not going to be able to go any faster. But Mamdani counts on the gullibility and stupidity of his brainwashed and brainless voter base that will buy whatever snake oil he's selling just because he's a brown Muslim, therefore oppressed, and hence an infallible man. I guess it's just too late for him now in 2025 to identify as a woman to earn a few extra votes from his woke ranks. Public policy is not a wish list. It is a contract between numbers and reality. Break that contract, and you get collapse with a halo. Safety was the debate's other flashpoint. Every New Yorker feels it. The unease in the subways, the random violence, the mental health crisis on our streets. To that pain, Mamdani and his allies offer a different prescription. Less policing, more social work. Enter the Be Heard program that I referenced earlier. Mental health teams replacing police for some 911 calls is what this project is about. The concept is humane. The execution is uneven and leaves a lot to be desired. The idea deserves a fair hearing, but the data? The program handles barely 40% of eligible calls in pilot zones. Most 911 operators mark potential cases as ineligible for fear of violence or weapons. Even when Be Heard shows up, follow-up care is rare and tracking inconsistent. The city comptroller calls it a program in search of infrastructure. Cuomo was right to say that one should pair social workers with officers and not replace them. Safety and compassion are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they are mutually dependent. Each time you remove deterrence, you invite danger. Every study, from the Bureau of Justice to the National Academy of Sciences, shows that visible policing reduces violent crime and saves lives, especially in minority neighborhoods most vulnerable to that crime. To pretend otherwise is to gamble with the very people you claim to protect. Yet the rhetoric of the debate made law enforcement sound like an embarrassment to be managed away. The truth? Without the rule of law, all that is left is the rule of whoever feels most aggrieved today. Programs like Be Heard could play a role if funded, tested, and measured honestly. Sliva was right to call out the absurdity of Mamdani's claim that what worked in Eugene, Oregon, can be extrapolated to New York City. The success of Eugene, Oregon's Cahoots program cannot be meaningfully extrapolated to a metropolis like New York City because the two cities operate under completely different social, demographic, and logistical realities. Eugene is a small, homogeneous community of roughly 180,000 people with lower crime rates, limited density, and a cohesive civic culture that allows for close coordination between social workers, dispatchers, and law enforcement. New York City, by contrast, is a complex urban organism of over 8 million residents spanning 5 boroughs, dozens of police precincts, and radically diverse neighborhoods with vastly different crime patterns, languages, and mental health profiles. The idea that a lightly equipped, unarmed crisis team could safely and effectively manage volatile encounters in a city with hundreds of thousands of 911 calls per year, many involving drugs, violence, or homelessness, is unrealistic. What works in a small, tight-knit, relatively low-crime environment like Eugene, Oregon, simply cannot scale to a hyperdense global city where unpredictability rules. Public safety is the first right. Without it, every other policy is nothing but an academic exercise. The issue of public safety is inexorably linked to the issue of defunding the police. While Mamdani claimed during the debate to want to take politics out of the question of accountability, he also thinks it is unfair for him to be held accountable for tweets of the distant past, which goes all the way back to 5 minutes ago in 2020, in which he repeatedly called for defunding the police. He claims to have apologized repeatedly for those tweets as though that were enough and as though he were actually a trustworthy individual. Beyond budgets and crime statistics lies a deeper question. What kind of city does New York want to be? The debate hinted at two visions. One sees New York as a community of reciprocal duties. Taxpayers, workers, entrepreneurs, immigrants, and families sharing responsibility for a complex machine. The other sees New York as a perpetual petition to government, a place where rights expand infinitely while obligations shrink to zero. The second vision is Mamdani's vision, and it is emotionally appealing. It offers moral comfort without personal cost. But cities that embrace it slowly lose the very spirit that made them magnets for ambition. In the debate, that disconnect surfaced in discussions about education. Promises to hire 1,000 teachers a year, expand bilingual instruction, eliminate testing barriers, all made by Mamdani, all sounded like worthy goals, perhaps, but with what budget and which metrics? New York already spends more per student than any other district in America, and nevertheless ranks mid-pack in results. Throwing money without measurement is not equity. It's entropy. It's stupid. Accountability is not a right-wing word. It is the moral center of democracy. If leaders are never held to their numbers, citizens become clients and government becomes theater. And What work of modern leftist fiction does not include a chapter on climate change, by the way? Let's talk about Local Law 97, passed in 2019 as part of New York City's Climate Mobilization Act. It is often hailed by progressives as a landmark in climate leadership, but in practice, it is a deeply flawed, economically destructive, and scientifically misguided piece of legislation. At its core, the law mandates that most buildings over 25,000 square feet reduce their carbon emissions by up to 40% by 2030 and 80% by 2050, under threat of punitive annual fines. This sounds virtuous, but its economic and practical consequences are severe. Retrofitting thousands of buildings, including co-ops, condos, hospitals, and schools, requires astronomical upfront costs in the tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars citywide. Property owners, already overburdened by taxes, insurance, and regulatory costs, will either pass those costs to tenants or defer maintenance and investment, accelerating urban decline. Many small landlords and nonprofits simply cannot afford compliance. Moreover, the law's premise that New York City's building emissions are a significant driver of climate change is scientifically dubious at best. New York City contributes a vanishing fraction of global carbon output, and the claim that incremental local reductions can save the planet is ideological rather than empirical. The climate models underpinning such laws have repeatedly failed to predict real-world outcomes, and the crisis is often exaggerated to justify massive state intervention and wealth redistribution under the guise of environmentalism. Finally, the policy ignores adaptation and innovation, focusing instead on punishment and coercion, rather than encouraging technological solutions or market-driven efficiency. Local Law 97 thus epitomizes the moral vanity and economic illiteracy of modern green politics. It imposes unpayable costs on working New Yorkers, damages property values, and seeks to solve a problem that is either overstated or fundamentally misdiagnosed. To be fair, Cuomo is living in the same la-la land as Mamdani when he claims that the law can be implemented and enforced without creating a huge and unfeasible financial burden for the owners of buildings in New York City. Mamdani simply dodged the question by replying that he agrees with the law, that he thinks it should be enforced, but at the same time claiming that he will assist the landlords without specifying how. Two things simply cannot be true at once. As though all the lies, misrepresentations, and fabulous claims made by Mamdani during the first 3/4 of the debate hadn't been enough, when each candidate was prompted to talk about their most admired U.S. president, New York City mayor, and politician in recent history, Mamdani did not disappoint by choosing the unholy trinity of progressive politicians who are responsible for concocting and implementing some of the most destructive and frankly stupid ideas in American history. Mamdani's choices were FDR, LaGuardia, and Bernie Sanders, respectively. Here's the breakdown as to why all of Mamdani's heroes are terrible choices. Let's start with former President Franklin D. Roosevelt. FDR was responsible for many disastrous policies, namely the New Deal's expansion of federal power, the Social Security Act of 1935, the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933, Wage and Hour Regulations, so the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, Court Packing Plan of 1937, Executive Order 9066, which led to the Japanese internment camps, the Wagner Act, otherwise known as National Labor Relations Act of 1935, the creation of Fannie Mae in 1938, and in general, creating a culture of perpetual dependency on the government. Let me break those down. The New Deal's expansion of federal power massively expanded the size and scope of the federal government, introducing the idea that Washington should manage economic life. Critics justly argue that this eroded constitutional limits, centralized authority, and created a permanent dependency on federal intervention rather than fostering the state's self-reliance and local autonomy. As far as the Social Security Act is concerned, while intended as a safety net, the Social Security Act established a mandatory government-run retirement system that critics say functions as a wealth transfer arrangement akin to a Ponzi scheme, unsustainable as demographics shift. It entrenched entitlement dependency and reduced private savings and investment. Let's now talk about the National Industry Recovery Act of 1933. This act gave government sweeping control over private industry, fixing prices, wages, and production quotas. The Supreme Court struck it down in 1935 with Schechter Poultry Corp. v. United States as unconstitutional. Economists argue it prolonged the Great Depression by suppressing competition and entrepreneurship. The Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933 paid farmers to destroy crops and livestock to raise prices during a period of hunger and poverty. This artificial market manipulation hurt consumers, distorted agriculture, and entrenched, once again, government control over food production. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, by imposing federal minimum wages and hour limits, priced low-skilled workers out of the labor market, especially minorities and youth, reducing employment opportunities and stifling small businesses. When the Supreme Court invalidated several New Deal measures, FDR tried to expand the court to add justices sympathetic to this agenda. Sounds familiar? This unprecedented movement threatened the separation of powers and politicized the judiciary, undermining confidence in constitutional governments. Perhaps the most egregious moral failure of the FDR presidency was Order 9066. This order authorized the internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of whom were U.S. citizens. It stands as a grave violation of civil liberties and racial justice. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935 empowered labor unions, granting them collective bargaining privileges backed by government force. Critics contend that it fueled union corruption, reduced efficiency, and discouraged investment, especially in heavily unionized industries like manufacturing. Let's now turn to Fannie Mae. Fannie Mae was designed to expand home ownership by buying government-insured mortgages. Over time, it became a quasi-public financial behemoth whose distortions in the housing market contributed to moral hazard and the 2008 financial crisis. In general, FDR created a culture of perpetual dependency on the federal government. His enduring legacy is primarily psychological. By redefining the citizen as a client of the state rather than an autonomous actor, his programs normalize dependency on government aid, eroding civic virtue, work ethic, and local community responsibility. Now let's look at Mamdani's favorite New York City mayor ever, Fiorello LaGuardia. Fiorello LaGuardia, though often romanticized as one of New York City's greatest mayors, and he was in office between 1934 and 1945, implemented numerous policies that, when viewed critically, set precedents for bureaucratic overreach, fiscal irresponsibility, and social engineering that burdened the city for decades. And now let's talk a little bit about Bernie Sanders, since he is still around. Bernie Sanders has advocated for democratic socialism, popularizing the term democratic socialism by framing it as a humane alternative to capitalism. This rhetoric obscures socialism's historical failures, romanticizes state control, and conditions Americans, especially the young, to view prosperity as something that has to be redistributed rather than created. Medicare for all. While appealing in principle, a universal government-run healthcare system would abolish private insurance, eliminate competition, and balloon federal spending by tens of trillions of dollars. Critics of Bernie Sanders' ideals for Medicare for all contend that it would lead to rationed care, long wait times, and reduced innovation, as seen in over-centralized healthcare systems abroad. Let's talk about another brilliant idea by Bernie Sanders, namely free college and student debt forgiveness. Sanders' educational platform, eliminating tuition and canceling debt, may relieve some individuals, but it unfairly socializes private financial decisions and transfers the cost to taxpayers who never attended college. It also incentivizes universities to keep raising costs, knowing that the government will pay the bill. Now, let's talk about the Green New Deal. Sanders' version of the Green New Deal envisions a total restructuring of the US economy around environmental mandates. Economists argue it would destroy entire industries, costs millions of jobs, and centralize planning power in Washington with negligible impact on global emissions without China's and India's cooperation, to say nothing of Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Now let's talk about Sanders' class warfare rhetoric. Sanders habitually frames politics as a moral struggle between the 99% and the 1%, reducing complex economic dynamics to moral binaries. This rhetoric undermines social cohesion, fuels resentment, and demonizes success, discouraging investment and entrepreneurship. No wonder Mamdani loves it. Let's talk about Bernie Sanders' tax and spending economics. His calls for wealth taxes, his high marginal income taxes, and massive public spending would discourage capital formation, drive out investment, and punish productivity. Historical evidence from the 1970s shows that high taxation often leads to slower growth and capital flight, not greater equality. While railing against big corporation, Sanders proposes extensive corporate regulation and ownership stakes for workers, which critics argue would stifle innovation, reduce competitiveness, and politicize private enterprise, a step toward state corporatism. As though all of that were not enough, Sanders has softened his once restrictionist stance on immigration and now opposes most forms of enforcement. Critics contend that this would depress wages for low-skilled workers, strain social services, and undermine national sovereignty, contradicting his pro-labor rhetoric. You simply cannot have both labor protections and also open borders. Nearly every Sanders proposal on healthcare, education, housing, and labor expands federal authority at the expense of states and local governments, eroding the constitutional principle of federalism and replacing self-government with centralized administration. I'm glad that nevertheless Mamdani thinks that he's going to be able to fight Trump in Washington, following the platform of Bernie Sanders. Sanders frequently invokes Nordic social democracy as proof that socialism can succeed, ignoring that those countries retain robust capitalism, low corruption, and strong property rights. This intellectual sleight of hand misleads Americans about economic realities and distorts the lessons of history from Venezuela to the Soviet Union. If all these ideas and the ideas of Mamdani's heroes seem too far-fetched and too far to the left, it's because they are. Let's not forget that Mamdani is no typical Democrat. Mamdani belongs to the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA. Although often wrongly conflated with social democrats, the DSA explicitly advocates for replacing capitalism with a socialist economy in which the means of production are collectively owned or democratically controlled, rather than privately held. While they frame their mission in moral language such as dignity for everyone and economic justice, their program calls for the abolition of profit-driven enterprise, nationalization of key industries, and the subordination of markets to political control. To describe this merely as pursuit of dignity is therefore misleading, since their underlying goal is not reforming capitalism to make it fairer, as traditional social democrats once sought, but rather to dismantle it altogether in favor of a fundamentally different socio-economic system, and one that, by the way, has failed wherever it has been implemented. Rather than being honest about the pursuits of the DSA and their antagonism to capitalism, Mamdani simply resorted back to insisting on free buses, free childcare, and rent freezes. The October 16 debate was not just about who will occupy City Hall. It was about what we now call truth. We watched politicians turn complex problems into morality plays and facts into props. But New Yorkers deserve leaders who treat words and numbers as contracts, not as costumes. Civic courage is the new scarcity. The future of the city depends on those willing to speak in complete sentences about budget lines, safety data, and international law without fear of hashtags or fashionable rage. If we want a city that remains vibrant, safe, and free, we must demand competence with the same fervor we once reserved for compassion. Because compassion without competence is cruelty in disguise. So, to finish this episode, just remember, the next time that a candidate promises you everything for nothing, remember, every dollar spent without math is a lie you will pay for later. And every policy built on wishful thinking and wishful language is a bridge built on fog. Thank you for your attention. This was another episode of American Reconquista with your host, Emilio Pons. If you liked this video, please don't forget to like it, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and to share it with your friends. Thank you, and until next time.